Right now, I am standing in Asunción, the capital and largest city of the South American country of Paraguay. We are here on the banks of the Bay of Asunción, on the Paraguay River, here at the base of the Historic Center of Asunción. It was here in 1537 that the Spanish would establish the first European settlement in the Rio de la Plata basin. That's really kind of the bottom half of South America. So for that reason they call Asunción the mother of all cities, because it was from here in Asunción that other Spanish cities like Buenos Aires would be established. Now, it's only a few days away from the beginning of winter here in the southern hemisphere, and so it's a nice 22, 23 degrees during the day, maybe 16, 17 degrees at night. Very pleasant. We're not quite in the tropics. The tropics actually start a couple hundred kilometers north of here, but we're quite close to the tropics. So this is basically winter weather here in beautiful Paraguay. Now, behind me we have the sign of Asunción, and behind that, the Palacio de López. That is the official presidential palace of the president of Paraguay. Now, right now, the president is Santiago Peña. He actually is a fluent English speaker, and if you want to hear him talk about Paraguay and what he hopes for the country, you can actually look him up and you'll see many interviews that he's done, long interviews, like hour-long plus interviews in English. It's quite impressive. Now, we'll flip around the camera really quickly. Behind me, we have the Costanera. It's kind of the waterfront promenade here along the Bay of Asunción. And way in the background, you might be able to see it, is a brand new bridge that crosses the Paraguay River and goes to the Chaco. Now, that bridge was opened only a year ago, and that bridge is called the Heroes of the Chaco Bridge. And the reason why it's called Heroes of the Chaco Bridge, the most important football stadium here in Asunción is called Defenders of the Chaco. Now, why is that? Well, that's because there was a massive war in 1932 between Paraguay and Bolivia over control of the Chaco, which is that area across the Paraguay River over there. It was thought to be kind of worthless. It was very unpopulated, which is why the borders between Paraguay and Bolivia were not decided. But in the 1930s, oil companies came to both the governments of Bolivia and Paraguay and said, we believe that there's valuable oil to be found in what the Spanish called the green hell, el verde infierno. And so Paraguay and Bolivia actually fought a brutal war, the most brutal war between two countries in Latin America in the 20th century. More than 100,000 people died. Now, Paraguay ultimately won that war. And so today is called, it's like, in English, it's like the Chaco Armistice Day. And then in Spanish, it's like Dia de la Paz del Chaco. And so that's actually a national holiday here in Paraguay. Although it's not quite as celebrated as perhaps other holidays, so you're not going to see quite as many festivities, but you do see perhaps a few more flags out and about than you might expect. All right, now, anyway, we'll probably continue our walk up into the city. Now, this Bay of Asunción here behind me, that's almost certainly why the Spanish chose here to settle, because they sailed up the Paraguay River and they found this kind of beautiful natural harbor, and they thought this is a perfect place to establish a city. Now, the word Paraguay is believed to come from Guaraní, meaning the river, something like the river from which the sea originates, something like that, referencing the fact that this mighty Paraguay River will ultimately go down into Argentina and finally out to the Atlantic Ocean with the Rio de la Plata, which is one of the biggest rivers in the world. We've got some friendly Paraguayans in the background there, yelling and waving. This country is one of the least visited countries in Latin America. It's a relatively unknown place. And so for many Paraguayans, seeing a foreign face, especially one filming a video, loudly speaking in English. It is a windy day, so I'm trying to be loud. Hopefully the audio turns out okay. Seeing that sight can be a little bit surprising to many Paraguayans. Now, Paraguay, of course, kind of the genesis, the beginning of Paraguay is in 1537, but Paraguay becomes independent from Spain in 1811, with the first dictator being known as José de Francia, although many people simply called him El Supremo. And ever since José de Francia, independence from Spain, El Supremo, Paraguay has been largely ruled by dictators ever since. Although, if you come to the country today, you will see a country that is, most people agree, headed at least in the right direction. Now behind me here, we'll turn this corner. It's a little bit loud. It is a kind of a main street. Behind us here is the Plaza of the Disappeared. And right there, we'll actually go up to it really quickly. This is actually a statue of Alfredo Stroessner. He was the dictator of Paraguay from 1954 until 1989. And there's a hill kind of a few kilometers south of here along the river. And it's the highest point in the city of Asunción. And on top of that hill, Stroessner commissioned a Spanish architect to erect a monument with all of the great heroes, the great leaders of Paraguay, and he of course included himself. And so after the dictatorship of Alfredo Stroessner ended in 1989, they took his statue from that monument and they brought it here to the Plaza of the Disappeared, because many thousands of people were disappeared during his dictatorial rule, his multi-decade dictatorial rule. And an artist actually took it and broke up the statue and then had it being kind of crushed in 2 concrete blocks, and you can see that there. And of course behind us is the Palace of Lopez and the beautiful giant Paraguayan flag waving, very iconic. Now we'll cross the street here. A little bit hard to do here in South America, here in Latin America. Crossing the street is always a little bit difficult because the car always has the right of way. They are bigger, of course, so it makes sense. Might makes right. So we always try to be careful crossing the street. Now, we're going to go a couple blocks into the city, and the reason why we're not going to walk directly in front of the Palace of Lopez is because even though on paper it is legal to film in public here in Paraguay, unfortunately, as one will experience going to developing countries, sometimes what is legal on paper and what is acceptable in reality is 2 very different things. And so actually we tried to do this video 2 days ago, and when we were walking in front of the Palace of Lopez, just walking in front of it, we didn't even linger, we were actually stopped by a police officer who told us to cut the video, turn it off, stop the video right now. He didn't say, oh, excuse me, could you please not film here? He said, turn off the video right now. And so we had to actually physically show him that the video was being turned off. And so the video unfortunately ended there. And because we were doing it pretty shortly before sunset, we didn't have enough light to do a second take. So now we're here again 2 days later doing another take, and hopefully this one goes through. Now I like to do these videos in one single take because it's authentic, it's real, and also because I am a little bit lazy. I do suffer from the sin of sloth a little bit, and so I do like to avoid editing whenever possible. Now we'll go up here, down this street here. Narrow sidewalks, a little bit hard to walk, but that's all right. Now, Paraguay has a GDP per capita of roughly $6,500 US. That puts Paraguay at about the 106th richest country in the world. So Paraguay is quite solidly a developing third world impoverished country. But if you look at real GDP growth rate, now that's GDP growth rate that accounts for population growth, and the population is still growing here in Paraguay. The average age, I do believe, is like 27. So this is a very young country. Now, Paraguay actually is at a very strong rate of economic growth in the past 10 years. I do believe it's about 3.3%. And so if you talk to many Paraguayans, they will say that the country is noticeably more wealthy today than it was, say, 10 or 15 years ago. And so even though Paraguay still has a very long way to go to prosperity, it's at least headed in the right direction. Now, Alfredo Stroessner, the dictator from 1954 until 1989, he is gone, but his party, the Colorado Party, still remains. In fact, they have been the ruling party of Paraguay since 1954, except for a brief 4-year break in 2008 when a Catholic bishop, he left the clergy so that he could enter politics, and he was actually elected president in 2008. Amazing. That's actually very unique. That doesn't happen a lot in the world, so kind of fascinating. We're walking actually past the palace of the vice president right now. There it is behind me. Beautiful little building. So anyway, he was elected president in 2008, and that was the first time that a non-member of the Colorado Party was in power. The first and only time since 1954. But his rule was cut short before the term officially came to an end because the Colorados decided to impeach him, and most international observers in neighboring countries considered it to be a coup. But, such is to be expected. Now, about half of the population, nearly half of the population of Paraguay is a member of the Colorado Party. The Colorado Party, like many parties in developing countries, retains power not as much through oppression, but instead through a policy of what is known as clientelism, in that it's very hard to get a good job here in Paraguay if you're not a member of the Colorado Party. But that being said, when I walk around here in Asunción, and I walk about 20 kilometers every day to see the city, and this is a metro area of roughly 2.5 million people. The exact definitions of Gran Asunción are a little bit blurry, but more than a third, and really nearly half, of the country's 6.6 million people live here in Asunción. So in many ways, I'm kind of getting to see nearly half of how the people here live. And walking around 20 kilometers every day, I have noticed a very conspicuous lack of political banners, political graffiti, something that you would see a lot of in neighboring Argentina or Brazil, which are much more thriving, dynamic, multi-party democracies. And so even though Paraguay is by no means a North Korea or anything approaching that level, this still is very much a developing one-party state. Now in just a moment, we'll be passing by the House of Independence. This is where, in 1811, Paraguay declared its independence from Spain. Now, like most countries in Hispanic America, nearly every country in fact, these countries became independent when Spain collapsed after it was invaded by Napoleon during the Napoleonic Wars. Now here we have the House of Independence. Now whether or not Paraguay becoming independent from Spain was a good idea, you'll have to answer that question for yourself, but that's where it happened. Now the first Supremo, the first dictator of Paraguay, José de Francia, he actually ordered that he made it illegal for Europeans to marry other Europeans. He hoped that by forcing miscegenation between Europeans and Amerindians, that there would be a mestizo people created, a people that were neither European nor Amerindian. Therefore, a people who could be more easily ruled, you might say. And in some ways, it seems to have worked because, at least statistically, at least according to census results, Paraguay is one of the most homogeneous countries in the Americas, in the Western Hemisphere. Something like 95% of the population here in Paraguay identifies as mestizo. Now, that is a little bit misleading because in reality, there is actually quite a bit of kind of racial diversity within the country. And you know, if you walk around Asunción or other parts of Paraguay, you are going to see a spectrum amongst the people. And we're going to walk now here. This is the old, I'll flip around, well actually right here behind me, this is the Plaza de Armas. So this is, I do believe, the very first plaza of the city. Many countries in Hispanic America have a Plaza de Armas at their historic center. And here, at this building here, and you can actually see the sign, they have many signs here in Asunción, historical signs that teach you about the history. Now this used to be the original Congress of Paraguay. And lovely little classical structure, but maybe a little too small for their needs. And so they built a new, more modern structure here about 20 years ago, and that's the new Congressional Palace. And we'll walk down the street a little bit and get a better view of the front. But anyway, like most cities in the Americas, Asunción is at least somewhat racially segregated. If you go to the wealthier parts of Asunción, like here in the center or around the fancy new shopping malls in the eastern part of the city, you're going to see a much more European population. Whereas if you go to the slums that are around the costaneras, the villas as they are called here in Paraguay, you're going to see a much more Amerindian population. And then if you go to the more working class neighborhoods, the more middle class neighborhoods, where they are doing things like car repair, you'll see much more kind of mestizo population. Now we are crossing the street here and we're going to a statue. Hopefully we can get there. Many parks in Latin America, unlike Northern America or Europe, many parks in Latin America have large metal fences around them. And they're only open sometimes. So hopefully this one is open. Oh good, it is open. The gate is open. Wonderful. All right, well now we'll go inside here. Now we'll go up these steps. And behind me here, on horseback, with the extended sword, that is Francisco Solano Lopez. He succeeded his father, Lopez Sr., to become the dictator of Paraguay in the mid-1800s. And it was during his rule that one of the most devastating wars in the history of the Americas, in the history of the Western Hemisphere, occurred. That was the Paraguayan War, also known as the War of the Triple Alliance. That's where Paraguay fought a war against Brazil, Argentina, and Uruguay from 1864 until 1870. Now, after the Spanish and Portuguese empires collapsed here in the New World, the borders of all of these new countries, Argentina, Brazil, Uruguay, Paraguay, Bolivia, they weren't very certain. Where did Paraguay end? Where did Brazil begin? Nobody really knew. And so Solano Lopez, who fashioned himself something of a military genius, I do believe he once called himself, or perhaps many times called himself, the Napoleon of South America, he thought, you know what, I can take on all these countries, I can establish a giant Paraguay. And so he went to war with all these countries, and it ended disastrously. Within a few years, Paraguay was defeated militarily, and then they launched about a year-and-a-half guerrilla-long war. And at the end of this year-and-a-half-long guerrilla war, Solano Lopez had basically exhausted the entire male population of the country. Roughly 90% of men in the country had been killed. and Solano Lopez was kind of circled on a hill just a couple hundred kilometers north of here, and he actually fought to the very end. He refused to surrender, and I do believe he was speared by a Brazilian horseman, and it's said that as he died, he shouted out, "I die with my country." And so sure enough, Paraguay was incredibly devastated by losing 90% of their male population, and so it really would take many generations for Paraguay to really get back to what it was. And in some ways, Paraguay has still not yet recovered. But even though it was such a horrible and devastating period within Paraguay's history, he's still remembered somewhat well, kind of as a symbol of the Paraguayan spirit, of Paraguayan vigor and might. You know, even though this is a small country, it is kind of a very warsome, fearsome country. You know, the War of the Triple Alliance, the Chaco War. You know, this is a country that has very much militarily punched very much above its weight. Now, maybe part of the reason why this country has more of a nationalistic spirit than you might see in other countries in Latin America is because here in Paraguay, actually the largest percentage of the population of any country in the Americas can speak an Amerindian language. That's Guaraní. Now, they say that roughly half of the population of Paraguay can speak fluent Guaraní, although that is a little bit misleading because in reality, most of the people, oh, and we just had a little motorcycle accident. A lot of people drive motorcycles here. Looks like they're okay. Uh-oh. Well, that was, could have been much worse, but looks like they're all right. Anyway, most people here actually speak kind of a Creole, a Spanish-based Creole with strong Guarani influence that is known, I believe, as Jopari, something like that. So how many people actually speak true, pure, fluent Guarani? Probably not even close to 50%. But when you go out into the rural areas, you are going to see a lot of kind of older people who do actually speak that pure Guarani. And Guarani actually was suppressed somewhat, like many Amerindian languages here in Latin America, but it was actually promoted to an extent by the government oftentimes for populist and nationalistic reasons, as a way to kind of differentiate Paraguay from other countries here in Latin America. So it's quite fascinating. I actually walked by the U.S. Embassy a couple of days ago, and everything, all of the signs on the outside were in English, and then translated into Spanish and Guarani. Quite fascinating. Now, here we have the Cabildo. That would have been the center of colonial government during the period of Spanish rule. Buildings that are called cabildos, that are like this, can be found throughout the Hispanic world. Lovely little building, pink, like many government buildings here in Paraguay and other parts of Latin America. They use a very pleasant pink color. What more is there to say about Paraguay? I must say that if Paraguay does not have the best international reputation, but I would say that its negative reputation is a little bit overblown because it's quite a safe country. The murder rate here is one of the lowest in Latin America. It's still a little bit higher than what you'll find in Europe or Northern America, but it's quite low by the standards of Latin America. And indeed, in my experience, walking around Asunción, I don't see even a fraction of the barbed wire or electrified fences or guard dogs or armed security guards that you would see in other parts of Latin America, like say neighboring Brazil. And so this is a place where you do feel much safer than in many parts of Latin America. There is this feeling of progress, of economic progress, of social progress, of cultural progress, of progress with security. It's a young country. There is a feeling of optimism and of progress and of movement. And so it is a wonderful place. And I think that my experience here in Asunción, here in Paraguay, is much different than what someone might have experienced coming here in the 60s, 70s, 80s, or even 90s, when it was a much poorer and less developed country than it is today. And so one could say that Paraguay is a country where most things that could go wrong went wrong in the past. But now in the present, even though it is still a poor, one-party country, a lot of things are going right. And so if you're here in the southern half of South America and you're traveling about, I highly recommend stopping here in Asunción, here in Paraguay, maybe for a week, just checking it out. Now, finally, we have the Metropolitan Cathedral of Asunción, one of the most important Catholic churches here in Paraguay, a very Catholic country. And that's probably where we're going to end things. What more is there to say? You know, I don't think I really have much more to say. I really have enjoyed my time here. It does feel like a special place. It is, they call it the hidden gem of South America because so few people come here or know about it. They call it the heart of South America as well because it is located in some ways the geographic and political center of South America. And so, yeah, I think that pretty much covers it. Like I said, if you're down here in this part of the world, come here to the heart of South America, to beautiful Asunción, the mother of all cities, to beautiful Paraguay. All right, until next time, ciao.